Hello, and welcome to today's Training Industry Leader Talk, Building the Skills AI Can't Replace, sponsored by Allego, Corporate Visions, InfoPro Learning, Helmsley Fraser, and SIY Global. I'm Amanda, VP of Brand Strategy here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you join us here today. Before we get started, of course, I'd like to acclimate you to the Zoom platform so you can get the most out of today's session. Of course, you see a chat pod there, pop that open, submit comments, chat with other attendees. If you have questions for our speaker, please submit those in the Q&A pod, and we will address those throughout and at the end of the session for our Q&A section. Once this session ends, of course, a brief survey will appear in your browser. We'd love to get your feedback on today's sessions and content you might want us to cover here in the future. All leader talks are recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive an email from us that will include links to the on-demand recordings. If you've previously attended one of our events in the past, it's a pleasure to have you with us again today. If it's your first event, we'd like to welcome you. At Training Industry, we are dedicated to making the right connections that advance the business of learning. As part of that mission, we provide resources to support your role in L&D, like today's virtual event, our articles and research, live conferences, our podcast. You get the point. We also love to connect with you. Join us on your favorite social platform, and let's continue this conversation. Now, without any further ado, our next leader talk. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Ryan, the CEO of SIY Global, an EQ-powered leadership development provider. He's a trailblazer whose passion meets at the intersection of emotional intelligence, neuroscience, and AI-enhanced learning. I'm excited to get started. So Ryan, take it away. Ryan, are you with me?
I think Ryan's having some technical difficulties. I just got a message from him, so I think he's popping right back in.
Perfect.
So hopefully it might have been a little internet issue on his end. So he should be back with us shortly.
I bet our audience has had some internet issues before, and we can all be a little empathetic for Ryan's plight. We'll give him a few moments here. Tell me something in the chat about something you've learned today, a key takeaway, like a bright idea exchange while we wait here for Ryan to join us. Pop it in the chat. No matter which session you went to, a little nugget you wrote down on the corner of your page, or let's see. Ooh, he's joining us. You can still type in and share that nugget. But I see he's on his way back in here, and we'll be ready in just a moment. And I'm so glad because I got a chance to see this presentation the other day, and it was spectacular. So without any further ado, we can welcome back Ryan. We were just talking about how wonderful the internet can be, an internet connection. Come off mute, say hello if you're ready.
All right, yeah, thanks for your patience, everybody. Sorry about that. Let me just get everything set up and ready to go here, and we'll get started.
Beautiful. Happens to the best of the learning leaders. There was a lot of like hearts and patience
Okay,
granted, so no need to worry.
I appreciate that. All right, okay, so thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Ryan Heinl. I'm the CEO of SIY Global. For those of you who don't know us, SIY Global grew out of a program that we built inside of Google, which combined neuroscience, emotional intelligence, and mindfulness research into a leadership development approach that became one of the most popular internal programs in the company's history. And since then, we've worked with thousands of organizations across 50 different countries. But I'm not here today to just talk about us. I also have had lots of different conversations with CLOs and training leaders and heads of L&D over the last few years. And there's a pattern that I keep hearing, which is what I want to talk about today, which is that everyone seems to be increasingly valuing EQ or emotional intelligence. Stakeholders see it as a huge need, and yet when I ask what they're doing to develop it, the answer is almost always some version of a quick online course or a module in a manager onboarding program, or maybe there's an assessment involved as well. So today I want to unpack three things. First, why EQ has become arguably the most critical leadership capability right now, what's actually getting in the way of developing it, and what you can do differently to ensure that it's making a bigger impact on your organization. So here's where the conversation usually starts. Everyone nods about EQ, but let me show you something that changes the entire framing when we're talking about emotional intelligence. Let's start by addressing one of the bigger elephants in the room when it comes specifically to AI and how that's going right now, since that's kind of the theme of our program today. With AI implementation, something is, I think, safe to say, deeply broken between the expectations of the technology and the realistic returns. Because the vast majority of projects are failing to deliver the returns that most leaders are hoping for. And according to an MIT study, which many of you have probably seen, 95% of the projects aren't delivering the expected gains. Now, like many aspects of change management, it's easy to simply say that this is a question of adoption. If people would just use the technology as recommended, things would go faster. And often that is the case with many changes that we have had experience with in the past. But in this case, it's a bit different because this same study showed that at least 90% of the employees were using AI in some way. It's not just a fear about using something new or a resistance to using something new. Rather, it's a deep emotional divide over how we're all dealing with the huge changes that are coming with AI. This research was recently published in the Wall Street Journal, demonstrating that there's a significant gap in how executives and frontline workers perceive AI. At every level of leadership, enthusiasm for AI changes dramatically. At the top of the house, the C-suite is super excited about the potential. They are eagerly reporting on what it can do to their boards in terms of increasing their bottom line. And the reports about, and they're excited to report on how it's going to accelerate their progress against their targets with fewer people. At the same time, for frontline employees, there are still so many questions about how it's going to actually work and work well. And even from those who are happy to use AI, as you can see from the quote here, there are very real concerns about how well things will actually work. The implications, trust that the company will handle issues appropriately, wondering what role employees will play, and so on. Companies that want to move beyond flashy pitches that impress the C-suite and boards of directors and actually operationalize AI for real gain need to be addressing the emotional divide between them, not just dismissing it. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the research about what's going on with employees here. This is a meta-analysis that I'm going to share with you of several studies on what's been going on behind the scenes with AI adoptions. And there are four big areas where we tend to see resistance. The first is what's called techno stress plus cognitive overload. The main idea is that people aren't resisting AI because they're resistant or lazy. They are resisting because their brains are full. When organizations roll out new tech, especially when it's mandatory, it creates something researchers call techno stress, the mental strain of having to adopt and constantly keep up with new digital tools. That techno stress actually predicts resistance. When people feel overloaded, their willingness to adopt new things drops. And I think we can all relate to that. But the research also shows something important. The bigger driver isn't the tool itself, it's resistance to change. So, in other words, even if the tech is fine, the act of changing routines, having to process something new and novel and figure it out in terms of workflows and competence expectations. That's what really triggers the pushback. It's layering on these new expectations. So if leaders only respond with, let's give you more training, they're really missing the point. The problem isn't just skill, it's overwhelm, right? So because it's also likely that you're asking them to do not just one more thing differently, but a multitude of things differently at the same time. The bottom line is that AI can trigger this digital pylon, all these new things coming at folks at the same time. And we've seen how quickly AI is changing. So it's easy to identify with that. If it feels like one more thing, people are going to resist before they even try. And if it feels like a whole pile of new things, it's going to seem even more overwhelming. The second piece of this meta-analysis that I'm sharing with you is around psychological contract violation and erosion of trust. Change tends to create vulnerability. We feel vulnerable, we're doing something new we haven't done before, and employees have deep fears that their leaders won't accept them while they're in the learning phase. And researchers point to something called the psychological contract. And that's the unspoken deal employees expect from their employer. Things like fairness, support, and if I work hard, I'll be treated well. When people experience techno stress, they expect the new tech will add pressure, of course. If they already feel the organization has broken promises, they've overworked them, cut corners, ignored feedback, then the AI isn't seen as progress, it's seen as another breach of trust. So the same rollout can land differently depending on that level of trust. In a high trust environment, AI feels like an investment. In a low trust environment, AI feels like exploitation. That's why transparency matters so much. If leaders don't explain the why, if they don't understand the emotions, they don't have the emotional intelligence to understand how people are really feeling about the change and can't express that behaviorally, or don't involve the employees in the decisions to create a sense of agency, that techno stress turns into resistance fast because the real issue isn't the learning curve, it's the relationship between the employees and the leader. If employees don't trust leadership, AI becomes proof the company cares more about efficiency than people. The third fear that I'll share with you is the fear of displacement and systematic anxiety. AI creates a very specific type of anxiety, which is displacement fear. Yes, market forecasts say that AI could boost productivity and drive massive economic growth. But here's the problem. Global optimism doesn't comfort someone who's thinking, great, but is this going to erase my job? That fear triggers uncertainty and distrust, and it stalls adoption. People drag their feet, they avoid learning, they resist in subtle ways, not because they're irrational, but because the stakes feel very personal. Now let's talk about why leaders don't often address this. They don't really know, and they're not really necessarily plugged in to the emotions that are related to this. They're living in the same uncertainty that all the other employees are living in, and many of them are potentially losing their jobs too. And if leaders want AI transformation, they have to address that emotional reality, not just the strategic story, the cognitive arguments for why using AI makes sense. And they have to be comfortable with the uncertainty themselves. The last piece that I'll share with you here is the identity threat and professional devaluation that can potentially come with AI. This last area is true to some degree with all changes, but it's uniquely acute in the era of AI. It's changing how we see our own value. For a lot of professionals, their identity is tied to the work that they do, the experience they've accumulated, the expertise they have, their judgment, their craft, their reputation. In fact, one of the very first questions that most of us get asked when we meet someone is, what do you do for a living? But AI has many people questioning their value. I recently heard someone say that AI could write their PhD thesis, which took them years in potentially a couple of hours. And they wondered if it was worth it. They ended up deciding yes, but that's a story for another day. That's why resistance often shows up as blocking, stalling, or fighting. Not because people are being difficult, but because resistance can be an unconscious defense mechanism. It's self-protection. Here's the leadership trap. If you ignore this, you'll only hear surface complaints like the rollout was bad or we didn't get enough training. But underneath it, the fear is if AI can do this, what does that make me as a professional and as a valuable person in the organization? Changing the way that we view ourselves and our value takes a lot of work and self-awareness. So let's talk about how that value is shifting for people and what it means for their work. Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about AI in an EQ webinar, but stay with me here because this is exactly why the EQ conversation has fundamentally changed. AI requires us to ask ourselves, what is the value of the human worker in the future? And we believe it means more emphasis on vision. AI can only do what you dream it can do. Purpose, what's the value of what we're trying to do here? With AI, anyone can do more, but what's the true value? Greater judgment and discernment. So figuring out, is this good? Is this output that's been created good? Is it solving the problem? And is it right? More focus on collaboration, how AI does work with our people toward a common goal, right? So how do we collaborate with humans and AI? Problem framing, asking better questions so that the machine can solve real problems and human problems. They need to be directed by humans in order to do that. Systems thinking is a huge one in terms of recognizing the downstream effects that AI may not be able to see right now. And then finally, intuition and taste. And this one is especially unique to human beings, I think, and it's being talked about more and more these days. Intuition and taste is sensing what's off, determining what is quality or what will work in a real world. That comes uniquely from humans. Note that I'm not talking about just individual contributors here. That's traditionally, you would have categorized all of these as leadership skills. But the reality is that thanks to AI, individual contributors need these leadership skills far more than ever before. In an AI world, a single employee wields more power and influence than ever before. If they're not in lockstep with their peers, neither are the AI agents that they are directing and orchestrating. If they make poor decisions under pressure, so do their AI agents. If they fail to exercise good judgment, so do their AI agents. If they disagree with changes that are being made or don't like how a conflict is resolved, they may resist a new direction, and so may their AI agents. I think many of us are seeing this right now, that we are at the center of an environment that is becoming increasingly chaotic and subject to emotional hijacking. And that has many downstream implications based on the examples that I just shared with you. So let's sit with all that data for just a moment that I just shared. Think about the magnitude of what we're asking people to do, many of whom are feeling deeply unprepared for it. If we make this concrete, think of a leader on your team, someone who's technically excellent, a great strategic thinker as well. Now picture them walking into a meeting right after they got blindsided by bad news. Maybe their project budget got cut. Maybe they just had a tense exchange with a peer. How do they show up in that next meeting? Do they listen well? Do they make good decisions? Do they inspire confidence? If they haven't developed emotional intelligence, the answer is usually no. They might be brilliant on a good day, but the days that matter most in leadership, the high stakes, high pressure days, those are the days where EQ determines the outcome. That's what a stability skill means. It doesn't degrade under pressure. It's the skill that holds all the other skills together. And that changes the entire conversation about where EQ fits into your leadership development strategy. And that's why we're starting to see massive amounts of data come out that show how EQ is becoming one of the hottest growing skill sets these days. This is a piece of research from Oliver Wyman's Forum's 300,000 Voices report. This was published just last month. They asked employees which leadership capabilities matter most. And EQ is at the top at 47%. But here's the number that I want you to notice. Increasing AI related skills is at 39%. In a world or in an age of AI, where AI is becoming increasingly important, the most in-demand leadership skill isn't technical, it's human. The World Economic Forum called it a structural requirement just a few weeks ago. It's the skill that impacts leadership effectiveness far more than any other. So the data is clear. EQ matters more than ever, but here's what gets uncomfortable for a lot of organizations. Most leaders believe that they have EQ. 73% of executives believe their company's leaders have strong emotional intelligence, but only 31% of frontline employees agree. Just let that sink in for a moment. That's not a small gap, it's a chasm. And it means that most organizations are operating with leaders who believe they're emotionally intelligent, but whose teams would tell you a very different story. So there's a part of this that's often caused by a lack of self-awareness or an understanding of what real emotional intelligence is. But often what's happening is skill evaporation. Skill evaporation is what happens when we're put into a stressful situation and don't handle it the way that we know that we should. Because we judge ourselves under ideal situations and think anytime we fall short, that those times were anomalies. I know how to delegate. I just didn't do it this time because there was a deadline. I'm not a jerk. I just lost it in that meeting because I couldn't take one more complaint about this new system that we're implementing. But others judge leaders almost exclusively by how they act under pressure. And that disconnect is at the heart of the biggest problem in leadership development today. So why do skills evaporate under stress and pressure? And what role does EQ play in potentially changing that? Here's an old story to sort of illustrate the point. Someone riding a horse is asked, "Where are you going?" And the rider says, "I don't know, ask the horse." That's the emotional override. The horse is the emotional system, the rider is reasoning. And in the modern workplace, we keep training the rider while we're ignoring the fact that the horse is panicking. Think about that for a moment. Every leadership program you've ever run has been training the rider, teaching communication frameworks, delegation models, feedback structures, all rider skills. But if the horse takes over, if the emotional system hijacks the process, none of that training is accessible. Let's make this painfully practical with a common leadership skill that we can talk about. And oops, sorry there. Um, so in an ideal situation, sorry about that, lost my place for a second. In an ideal situation, we observe signals from the world around us and they get sent to our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's responsible for complex problem solving, empathy, creative thinking. That's where all of our leadership training lives. But when we're under pressure, a change to the system, a demanding executive, an unexpected setback, The brain detects a threat and releases stress hormones. And those hormones impair the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. They literally shut down the thinking part of your brain. It's almost like closing a gate that allows access to everything that we've learned. And instead, our attention gets diverted to the habit system, whatever our most rehearsed behavior is. The brain believes that this is the safest route. That's why leaders revert to old patterns in exactly the moments where it matters most. Think of a leader on your team right now, someone who's been through great training. They know what good looks like, but when the pressure's on, they revert back to what they know and what they've practiced over time, which is their habits. That's not a training failure. That's a neuroscience reality. That gate has just closed. So the question isn't whether your leaders have the skills, it's whether they can access those skills when it matters most. When they're under high demand, when the stakes are high, when the emotional pressure is real. And for most organizations, the answer is they can't, at least not consistently and not reliably. And that's a failure. And that's not a failure of your leaders. It's a failure of the approach that we've taken to try to ready them for these high pressure situations. So what do we do about it? There are two fundamental paths that we can consider. While it's a bit of an oversimplification, the best way to think about what's happening under pressure and demand is to think about this gate that I've referred to earlier. So shutting off access to those crucial leadership skills when we need them. And there are two approaches for dealing with this. The first is what most of us are already doing. We train a behavior so intensely that it becomes a habit, part of an automatic system. If it lives in the habit network, it survives that gate closing on us under pressure. The second is different, developing the capacity for emotional regulation so that the gate stays open longer. Give the brain more time to access the prefrontal cortex even under pressure. So let's look at each one here very quickly. And we'll start with the first approach because it's probably the one that most of us have been doing up to this point. The behavioral model first appeared back in the 1960s and 70s, and it was really revolutionary. Before that, leadership was sort of looked upon as the great person theory, either you had it or you didn't. This model said, no, we can break leadership into observable actions and we can train them. And that was a huge step forward. The approach follows a specific logic. You teach knowledge and skills, you show a positive model, you practice with corrective feedback, and eventually the brain recognizes the situation and applies the behavior. So you're building a habit. It's elegant and it goes around the emotional system that we've been talking about entirely. The theory is it doesn't matter what you're thinking or feeling as long as you demonstrate the right behavior, like a machine. We can all understand why this is very attractive to businesses. But here's the catch. It requires two things that are increasingly rare today in the workplace. First, it requires extensive, ongoing, repeated practice with reliable corrective feedback for every single behavior. Secondly, it assumes a similar environment. The training experience and on-the-job experience have to appear similar enough to trigger the right behaviors without much cognitive effort. And the calm, focused environment of the training session looks nothing like the hectic, nonstop, unpredictable work environment. So not only that, but the situations that leaders are facing today probably look nothing like the ones they trained for 6 months ago. This model was brilliant for its time. It was designed for a world with more stability and less change. And that's not a world that your leaders operate in today. So what does the second approach look like? The one that keeps the gate open longer. This is the EQ powered approach. It's about learning to control the gate itself. It's that missing capability, regulation under pressure. This isn't take a deep breath and calm down. It's a trainable, expandable neurological capacity. The ability to notice when your threat response is activating, why it's activating, and choose your response rather than automatically reacting to that situation. And this is where the shift really happens because once you add this capability to your leadership strategy, everything else you've already started doing becomes dramatically more effective. The behaviors start to stick, the coaching lands, the frameworks actually get used in moments that matter. So the question becomes, how do you systematically develop this capacity across the organization? That takes us to a core concept that we call the EQ pivot. This is a simple but profound shift in how you design leadership development. Instead of developing EQ as a behavior, show more empathy, be more self-aware, manage your emotions better, you develop it as a capacity, a foundational neurological capacity that enables every other behavior that you're trying to build. The goal is emotional awareness and stability first, so that leaders can apply the right behaviors under pressure. It's the difference between handing someone a workbook on how to swim while they're drowning and throwing them a life preserver so that they can actually think for a moment. Once leaders can observe their own thoughts, name their emotions, name what's happening, and regulate enough to get choice back, then skills training actually becomes usable under pressure. And EQ isn't just and EQ is not just self-management. It also includes understanding emotions so that you can lead and coach. Now, this might sound like nice and like it's nice in theory. So let me show you where it was actually built and proven out inside one of the most challenging and demanding environments on the planet. In 2006, Google presented perhaps the ultimate case study for this. They were growing incredibly fast. They were reshaping the digital landscape with no roadmap. They had the world's top talent with off the charts IQs and skills, but stress was very high. Collaboration was a struggle in some cases, and conflict started to slow things down. That was when an engineering manager named Chad Mang Tan, one of Google's original employees, believed that emotional intelligence could help. But he found that most EQ courses were focused on only behaviors. And as he put it, people showed up expecting to be told how to play nice, share candy, and not bite their coworkers. So he set out to solve three problems. First was, how do we get technical people to take emotions seriously? How do we build a foundation of calmness and clarity? And how do we make sure that this works in a wide range of stressful situations? So he worked with top neuroscientists at Stanford. He engaged attention training experts and focused on practical workplace applications. And together they built the original Search Inside Yourself programs, which was one of the most popular programs in Google's history and consistently one of the highest rated. And that's the origin of SIY Global. It was built at Google, grounded in neuroscience, and tested by engineers. So let me show you how organizations are actually deploying this at scale and where they're starting. We've found that organizations need EQ in three distinct types of moments, and understanding which moments matter most to your organization is the key to designing the right strategy. The first is the foundation, developing a baseline of emotional awareness and regulation that every leader needs. This is the operating system upgrade. The second is EQ within a specific skill context, embedding emotional intelligence directly into the leadership skills you're already developing. Things like delegation, coaching, managing through change, influencing. And the third is EQ in the moment, building the capacity to regulate and redirect in real time during the high stakes situations where they matter most. So let's take a look at each one of these. To get real ROI from EQ, from an EQ powered approach, you first need to create a common understanding of what performance-based EQ is. And EQ has been around for decades. The most well-known model is Dan Goleman's, and it's been massively influential. The problem is that EQ has become a bit generic and sometimes dismissed as a wellness thing or often a bolt-on to a competency model or a skills taxonomy. We built a workplace first model that's based on the amazing research that Goleman originally did, as well as others, but it's grounded in modern neuroscience and designed for a high performance leadership and workplace environment. We call it emotional dynamics, and it treats emotions as data, not as problems to eliminate. Has five components: emotional awareness, managing emotions, emotion enhanced thinking, constructive empathy, and social awareness. So I'll go a little bit deeper into each one of these very quickly. Emotional awareness, as you can probably guess, is about having real-time, in-depth understanding of the thoughts and perceptions that are driving your emotions. Managing emotions is about being able to move from compulsion to choice. This is where we get the greater capacity to access leadership skills to begin with from. Constructive empathy is about understanding empathy, not only from a cognitive standpoint, but from an embodied standpoint, but also maintaining accountability and leveraging that understanding of your own and others' emotions to take action in ways that are going to be beneficial to the individual and to the organization. Emotion enhanced thinking is about using your emotions as a performance multiplier. So, for example, if you are doing an analysis task, you might want to shift your emotional state to a calm state so that you can focus better. If you're doing a creative task, you might want to become more activated so that you can have more creative thoughts. Social awareness, as we talk about it, has to do with understanding the emotions of a group. Probably many of you have heard the term emotional contagion, and that's a very real thing and has very real performance implications within an organization. So for leaders, they need to understand the emotional atmosphere of a team or a group. And that's what we talk about when we talk about social awareness. Notice the framing here, though. Not be nicer, not don't feel negative emotions. It's about using emotions as information to improve decisions, collaboration, and performance. These are all trainable. That's the key point. Let me walk you through how we then address the EQ aspects of specific leadership skills. I think it's best to use an example to illustrate this. Delegation is a good one because we all understand it incredibly well, I'm sure. I've coached many leaders over time that struggle with delegation, and yet the concept itself is pretty straightforward. And I can think of one person in particular I coached who was incredibly talented, senior leader, very likable, very technically capable, and he'd gotten promoted very quickly. But his team was really struggling to show progress, largely because he wasn't delegating well. And the thing is, he had training and he'd tell me exactly what he should be doing, but he wasn't doing it. And finally, he said, I just don't trust that they're going to do a good job. And I'm afraid that in the end, that's going to reflect badly on my part of the organization and me personally. Because emotions drive the behavior, pride, anxiety, insecurity, loss of control, avoidance of uncertainty, that is what was driving him to avoid delegating. And so he needed to understand that those were the things that were the horse that was driving his response in those situations. And that allowed him, that created the unlock for him in order to then be able to address those thoughts and emotions and stories that were driving those thoughts and emotions in order to make progress. Now, some people argue that who cares what leaders are feeling as long as they behave correctly? But if you want them to behave correctly, they need to understand how they're feeling. So let me take this one step further and let's talk about how we implement this at the organizational level. In this scenario, we were working with an insurance company, and the pitch was AI will make you faster. Leaders and underwriters heard that, who were given a new co-pilot tool that was supposed to speed up the underwriting process, heard a machine is now grading your competence. That's the status threat that they heard when that AI will make you faster argument was provided to them. So adoption stalled usage became performative. People quietly did it the old way, and they just used the AI to as a confirmation tool rather to actually versus actually speeding up the process. In the end, what they did differently is they treated AI adoption as what it was, which was an identity shift, not a tool rollout. They named the threat trigger, which was that identity threat that I mentioned. They reframed competence from I already know how to do this and I'm expert at underwriting to I need to learn fast and figure out how I can use the AI to become even more productive. And they gave leaders micro practices to help them stabilize before dealing with a range of different stressful situations. So, this isn't just about the individual leader feeling better or even the individual employees feeling better. The Oxford Business School research that I have on this slide shows that EQ as a strategic priority makes your transformations 2.6 times more likely to succeed. Transformation fails when we treat it like a technology problem instead of a human problem, which is what it is. This is risk management for adoption and execution. The last piece that we'll talk about is addressing the moments that matter when you apply EQ in the moment of need. And research shows that what we call micro practices done during the day can have a profound effect on outcomes and performance. And these are just 90-second exercises that you can do to reframe your perspective, take control of your attention, and help to control that horse a little bit better during the day. And there's actual causal research that backs this up. There was a recent randomized control trial published by George Mason University and Texas A&M, and they showed that cognitive appraisal exercises done in 1 to 2 minutes delivered 2 or 3 times during the day saw significant performance enhancements over time. And this was a landmark study that they just recently concluded. So quick, short bursts of these types of micro practices where you're reframing your perspective, you're grabbing hold of your attention, and you're focusing on what is really the outcome that you want and what is most important can make a dramatic difference in terms of helping individuals deal with, especially leaders, deal with these challenges and the pressures that they're facing in the moment. The last piece I'll talk about here is how EQ produces compounding returns. So we started out talking about return on impact of EQ. We know it's a skill that's in top demand. We know it's growing faster than almost any other skill. Question is, how do you get your stakeholders to buy in? And like any learning initiative, it's tricky to say that you earn back $3 for every $1 you spend. But there's a powerful way to frame it, which is the compounding ROI effect. What happens at the individual level, then the team level, then the leadership level, then the organization level. And you can see an example of that here. There's a large body of research connecting EQ to decision quality, to engagement, to psychological safety, leadership effectiveness. I'm not going to make you read all of these right now in the webinar, but we will share this page with an appendix to all the studies that are cited. The point is simple. What we're really seeing is a compounding effect where EQ leads to higher performance at the individual level, which then affects the team, which then affects the leadership performance, which then affects the organizational performance. If you take nothing away from nothing else away from what we talked about today, it should be that EQ opens up access to every other skill you're trying to teach. If you look at this here in this diagram, leading others, all the skills underneath there, leading self, all the skills underneath there, leading the business, all the skills underneath there. EQ is at the center of it all. It's not a competency equal among others. It's the key to getting everything else right. And I'm at time, and that's where I'll stop. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate all of your attention today. And please follow up if you're interested. You can get in touch with anyone at SIY Global if you have more questions, or you can get in touch directly with me as well. I'm always happy to talk more about any of these topics. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Ryan, thank you so much. Loved the content, compounding EQ. I love that. And it wasn't half bad that your slides were beautiful and relaxing to look at, leading us into one of our final hours of our leader talk today. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be taking a 15-minute break. Up next, we have Sarah and Jessica for their session sponsored by Allego, how to build, how to blend AI and human insight for better learning outcomes. All right, we will see you over there soon. Stick around, join us for that last session. Thanks again to Ryan and SIY Global. Bye now.